how often do you find yourself in this situation? So you are doing a SAT writing or SAT reading test, or you're doing ACT reading, ACT English, or even ACT science, and you're stuck between two choices. You're trying to decide, you've eliminated the other two, and you're trying to decide, okay, with these last two choices, which is the one I'm going to go with? And inevitably, somehow, you more often than not, perhaps more often than chance would dictate, you more often than not pick the wrong answer of the two, or you pick one and then switch it and then switch to the wrong answer. So this sounds familiar. In this video, I'm going to talk about one of the reasons why this happens and what you can do to address it. So what I want you to do first, this question is an old SAT sentence completion question. So this is not a question you're going to see, a question type on the SAT or the ACT. I'm using it because it illustrates what I'm going to talk about really well, this question type especially. But what we're going to talk about, again, applies to SAT writing, ACT English, SAT and ACT reading, and ACT science especially. Maybe even math to some extent, but those are the big ones. So what I want you to do is go ahead, pause the video, try this question on your own. The basic idea is you got to find the word that you think fits best in the sentence. Try this one on your own. Don't use a dictionary. Try this with no aids whatsoever, and then we'll talk about what's going on with this question. So you have your answer. Hold that aside. We're going to talk about that in just a second. So where this video comes from is from an observation that I've made over many years of tutoring students, and this happens again and again and again. And it was only until recently that I think I finally understood, with the help of a book, which I'll introduce in a second, what's going on in these cases. So when you're stuck between two choices on reading, writing English, and science, whichever passage, whichever question type, very often what you're choosing between, not always, but very often, is you're choosing between, on the one hand, a choice that you don't really understand. So maybe it contains hard vocabulary, maybe it's got using punctuation in a weird way, or it's confusing, you don't really understand what it's saying. So that's one choice. And then the other choice that you're often choosing between is a choice that you understand, but you're not 100% satisfied with it as an answer to the question. So it doesn't really seem to answer the question perfectly. Maybe if you squint hard enough, it looks all right. It's kind of a weak choice. So very often when I was working with students, they would get stuck in this situation. They would have, on the one hand, a choice they don't really get or don't even know what it means. And on the other hand, a choice that they get what it means, it's familiar to them, but doesn't really work very well as an answer. And most students in this situation, and maybe you find yourself in this situation, and maybe you did in the question we just went over, or we're going to go over, most students pick this option. They'll pick the choice that they're familiar with, they understand, even if it doesn't fit 100%, that's the one they go with, not the one they don't know. And most of the time, it actually ends up that this is actually the wrong answer, and the right answer was actually this one. This happens so often that I've just, over the years, it's just such a consistent mistake, if we can call it a mistake, well, more of a bias. It's such a consistent bias that something is going on. So over the years, I've always said to students, well, if you're in this situation, pick the one that's less familiar to you, because that's often correct. But what's going on here? So let's dive deeper into what I think is going on here and how we can address it. So let's actually go over the question that you did, and we'll see if you fell into the same trap. Maybe you didn't, maybe you did, but we can still use this to illustrate the idea. So the blank nature of the virus allows it to continually change its form and thus go undetected by the body's immune system. So we have 5 choices: virulent, contagious, debilitating, protean, and benign, and we need to know which one works best. Now, there's a few that we might be able to get rid of relatively quickly. Benign, if you know what that means, it's positive, and clearly we're looking not really for something positive. We're talking about how a virus can change its form and go undetected by the immune system. That's not really a good thing, so to call it benign doesn't really make any sense. We might also be able to get rid of debilitating, because debilitating means to weaken. And while that is negative, it doesn't really make sense in this context. We're not talking about how the virus can weaken or cause someone to fall ill or lose their strength. We're talking about how the virus itself can change forms. So let's get rid of those 2. Maybe you picked one of those and maybe you still fell for the same issue. But let me get into more detail on these 3 choices especially. So remember what we said. And let's say you were stuck between, let's say, protean and contagious. I'll come back to virulent in a second. But let's just look at contagious and protean. This is the situation that students find themselves in. This is exactly it. We all know what the word contagious means. Contagious typically describes viruses, bacteria, illnesses. So that seems to be familiar. But when you look at it in the sentence, it doesn't really make sense. I mean, it makes sense, but not really. Like, the contagious nature allows it to change its form and go undetected. I mean, contagious means it spreads between person to person, not really having to do with whether it's detected or not by the immune system. So it's not exactly clear how contagious is really fitting here. But again, it's so attractive as an option. It's so familiar. It seems so relevant in some ways that we might be tempted to pick it. And maybe you put B. Whereas protean, many of us we don't know what this word means. Protean looks like proton, but that's like chemistry. Like, we may not know at all what this word means. So this is our question mark word. It's the don't know what it means, don't know the vocab, don't know what to do with it. In this situation, this is the situation I was talking about. Most students pick choice B. They would pick the one that's familiar, even though it doesn't fit. And if you're one of those that did that, then this is really an important video for you. Even if you pick the right answer or pick something else, still an important video. But I hope you understand how some people would end up picking B, right? So they would pick B, or they may even pick A, because viru looks like the word virus, right? And so that may seem to go together. And again, so it's not, maybe you don't even know what the word means, but you still might pick it because it looks like it would be relevant because it looks like virus. But again, this protean, we just don't know what to do with it, so we just kind of ignore it. We kind of hold it to the side, we kind of pretend it doesn't exist, and maybe we'll pick B, maybe we'll pick A, but the right answer here is actually D, protean. Protean literally means able to change form. So, and that's exactly what we're looking for here, right? A word that describes something that can change form. That's protean. So once you have the definition, it's clear. But most people, if they're going to get this wrong, are going to pick B or maybe even A because those are more familiar and protean is less so. So back to the observation. So what I've told students and what I'm telling you now, when you're stuck between two choices, when one of them is a weak option, though it's familiar to you, it doesn't really fit, but you know what it means, and the other choice is a choice that's unfamiliar or hard to understand in some way, you don't know how it might fit, most students pick the former. They pick the weaker, familiar choice. So in this case, it was picking contagious because I know what it means, it seems relevant, doesn't quite fit, but I don't want to pick something like protean because I don't know what it means. Whereas what I want you to do, because in most cases this ends up being the wrong answer. So what I want you to do instead is not to follow the crowd, to overcome your bias, the bias that we all have, which I'll talk about in a second. Instead, choose the latter. Choose the harder to understand choice when you're making a guess, because very often, more often than not, it's going to be right. Not always, but more often. A few caveats. There are a lot of reasons why you might be stuck between choices. This is just one situation. It's just something that I've seen come up very often. This doesn't apply to all cases where you're stuck between two, but it's just something to keep in mind. The second thing is when you're stuck between two, evaluate the choices as best you can first. Like, don't immediately default to the hard choice or the unfamiliar choice, right? This is if you're like stuck between two, one choice you understand, another choice you don't, and that's as far as the analysis can go. In that situation, this is where you want to pick the hard one. The whole point of this discussion is for you to be more aware of your thought processes, to be aware of your biases as you do tests, SAT or ACT, and to try to resist that temptation. And if you think about why this makes sense, think about what the College Board or the ACT are trying to do. They're trying to push you away from right answers and push you towards wrong answers. One of the easiest ways to do that is make right answers be hard, unfamiliar, confusing, at least superficially so, and to make wrong answers seem attractive, right? Relevant, easy words, simple concepts, right, to draw you to it. So if we understand what the College Board and the ACT are trying to do, we can try to counteract it. So why did I want to talk about this especially today? Well, right now I'm reading a book. It's actually quite good. Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Does various studies and economics and cognitive science and the intersections between that and psychology. Very interesting book. But I was reading the book and I read this part of the passage and suddenly I realized, this is a deeper issue for all of us in terms of our own cognitive biases. So this is what I read. He was talking at the time about taking a driver's test. So it actually was in the context of taking a standardized test, or at least a driver's test that's multiple choice. And this is his experience. So he said, but there were questions where no good answer came to mind, where all I had to go by was cognitive ease. If the answer felt familiar, I assumed that it was probably true. If it looked new or improbably extreme, I rejected it. So notice this is exactly what we were just talking about, right? Choice feels familiar, we pick it. We don't really know what's going on with the other one, we ignore it. The lesson is that predictable illusions inevitably occur if a judgment is based on an impression of cognitive ease or strain. Anything that makes it easier for the associative machine to run smoothly will also bias beliefs. So this gets into what he's talking about in terms of these two different brain systems of thought, system 1 and system 2. So I won't go into the details on that. Long story short is this is exactly what we've been seeing. We are biased to the familiar because the familiar is cognitively easy for us to deal with. And we, as at heart in some ways, we're all kind of lazy cognitively. By default, we are going to default to the more cognitively easy choices, aka the familiar choices, over those that require us to do more work or that seem unfamiliar, kind of related. So now that you know this is a thing, you want to do what you can to avoid it. So if we go back to our question, these wrong answers, virulent to some extent, but especially contagious, and maybe other ones, seem familiar, but don't mistake familiarity with correct, and don't mistake unfamiliarity with incorrect. So when you're looking, for example, in an English test, if it's a strange grammar structure, it's a strange sentence structure, don't immediately think it's wrong, right? If it seems familiar and comfortable, maybe that's good or maybe not, right? You have to take a second and try to avoid the instant gut reaction and kind of take a step back and say, okay, on an ACT science section, am I picking this because I think it's the best answer or because it's familiar and I don't want to pick the one that's unfamiliar, right? In this case, so if we go back to the question, the disciplined move would be to say, okay, contagious, it's familiar, but it's wrong. It does not fit in the sentence, in the context we need it. So eliminate, right? Same thing with virulent, which means extremely damaging. Benign doesn't work, debilitating. So by process of elimination, POE, we get down to the answer. So again, this is another reason why process of elimination is so key. You focus on getting rid of choices that don't work, and whatever you're left with, very often the hard choice, that's the one you go with. So I hope this video was interesting. I hope it explained some of the reasons why we think the way that we do, and I hope that you can use it when you're doing your tests to avoid this cognitive bias, or at least make better guesses when you're stuck between two choices. Let me know what you think in the comments below, if this ever happened to you, if this makes sense, any other pointers or tips you might have when you're in this situation. Be interesting to get a discussion going. So let me know if you have any questions, and I hope to hear from you soon. To learn more about Reason Prep's SAT, SAT subject test, and ACT video courses, go to reasonprep.com/enroll, and you can find the link in the description below the video.